Can you hear us okay? All right. Well, first of all, I need to give a lot of credit to Bruce Fogarty, who just walked off the stage. Y'all give Bruce a round of applause. We all know the effort that Trammell puts into putting this event on and enable us to have these kind of conversations. But Bruce is one of the guys that puts in the blood, sweat, and tears to make it happen. Worked heavily with the administrator to get him down here. And speaking of that, Scott, thank you for coming down and being with us today. He fought Oklahoma weather, Dallas, DFW traffic, all to be here and have this conversation. So it's great to have you.
I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
Is he on?
It says that I'm on. It's got green. Yeah, is that good?
Is your microphone still on? All right, you're good.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear the administrator?
Yes.
Okay. Real quick before we start, our conversation will be fireside chat. So we're both regulators, and we're going to talk about the things that are important to all of us in this room. What things we are doing to protect our environment, our communities for future generations. The thing that I'm going to ask everybody to do, and I've done this earlier today, we don't all have to agree, right? Even Scott and I may have a difference of opinion. We need to respect each other and engage in civil discord and in civil conversation, because that's when ideas are born. And that's when we do things that advance the future of our nation and our people. So we're going to do that, ask everybody here to do that, and we'll have a chance for you to ask your questions as well. Scott, anything to say as we open up?
I'm just thankful to be here. It's good. Trammell and I have been talking about this for some time, and as I came into the fairgrounds here, every year that I come, it's always in October for OU Texas, so it's good to be here for something other than OU Texas. But Ryan and I met actually late last year, and got to know each other a little bit, so it's excited to be with you, Ryan, and excited to be with you as well.
Awesome. Well, Scott, let's open up with, start high level. Tell us why you come down to Earth Day today.
Look, it's an opportunity, I think, to share with folks across the country. We've been doing this over the last couple of weeks. We've been out in the field in various states. I was in Missouri yesterday, in Chicago the day before that, about getting back to the basics of with respect to the mission at the EPA. And to that end, we're trying to really set some metrics, some objectives to achieve measurable outcomes in some key areas. When you think about air quality in this country, we're roughly at 40% non-attainment right now. 120 to 130 million people live in non-attainment across this country. We can do better than that. Superfund sites. 1,322 Superfund sites across the country that need to be focused upon. Some of those sites, now get this, there's a national priority list. Some of those sites, like the one I visited this week in East Chicago, have been on the list for quite some time. The Port of Portland has been on the list for quite some time, 30 to 40 years in some instances. That doesn't sound like much of a priority. Water infrastructure, when you look at what happened in Flint, what happened in East Chicago as far as water infrastructure, to ensure safe drinking water. So we can get back to the basics, core mission in each of these key areas of air, land, and water. And honestly, it's something that we want to do to ensure that the partnership of the states is preserved as well. I think over the last several years, there's been an attitude, that's a displacement, if you will, of regulators at the state level partnering together to achieve good ends. To give you one stat, President Bush 1, President Clinton, and President Bush 2, 3 administrations. There were 5 federal implementation plans that were issued under the Clean Air Act. The past administration, there were 56. Now that says something. It says that that's an attitude of indifference or an attitude of displacement with respect to the states. I believe that regulators in Texas care about the air they breathe and the water they drink, and we need to partner with them to achieve good outcomes and not try to displace it. So those are some of the things we're focused on, Ryan, as we begin our journey at the EPA.
Well, thank you for that. Can you expand on something? And it's this, get into minutia a little bit. You know, a lot of people here in the political discourse, they assume, well, Republicans just hate all regulation. We're both regulators. Can you talk a little bit about what does good regulation look like, and then what does bad regulation look like?
You know, regulation, and this is a very profound statement, regulation ought to make things regular. You know, because those that are regulated want to know what's expected of them. And I think what's happened over the last several years is something that I've referenced as regulatory pancaking, where the EPA will come out and issue a regulation and say these are the mission control measures that need to be implemented, and then 2 years later or 3 years later issue another rule in a different section of the Clean Air Act or otherwise that displaces or strands the investment that happened 2 or 3 years prior. And so you have industry out there working to comply with the rule, investing capital to achieve good outcomes, and then in a short time frame that all being erased. What we ought to be doing as we do regulation is having a longer view. of setting some benchmarks and objectives as far as a reduction of air pollution under the NAAQS program as an example. And having a longer window of time saying, here's where we need to be in ozone, here's where we need to be in particulate matter, here's where we need to be in SOx and NOx. And then allow industry to use innovation and technology to reach those objectives. So certainty, a longer term view, I think are very key to making things regular for those that are regulated.
One thing, I hear you talking, and it reminds me of something that's frustrated me. I've only been in office 2 years, engineer back prior to that.
It's been 51 days for me or so, I think.
Okay, so man, I'm the old hat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing that frustrates me is the political dynamic in which Republicans are cast as anti-environmentalists. And I think I work every day to try to change that. Part of being here is for us to change that. I only see that from the microcosm, which is a big cosm of Texas. But tell me, what do you see? Is that when you go around the country?
I think that's right, Ryan. I think what's happened over the last several years is we've been told as a country that we have to choose between jobs and protecting the environment. And I think that's a false choice. If you go back to 1980, well, let's go back a little bit before that. It was President Nixon who created the EPA, as you know. And then the several pieces of legislation, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act as examples, were passed in the 1970s. And those pieces of legislation, Congress recognized the importance of the partnership of the states at achieving better air quality and better water quality. And so, since 1980, we've obviously had a tremendous amount of economic growth as a country. But do you know in that same time frame, we've reduced criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act by 65%? By 65%. And that is something that
Excuse me. Hang on just a Sorry about that, folks. As I said, when those kind of things happen, it takes away the ability of all of us to engage. Thanks for your patience. You want to keep going?
And I think what I was trying to say is that we have achieved pro-growth outcomes. We have grown our economy since 1980, but at the same time reduced pollutants. I think we actually do it better than anybody in the world in that regard. And so we need to reject the paradigm that says, or the false choice that says, it's either jobs or growth or the environment. We can actually do both, and we've achieved that as a country.
So, unpack a little bit. Ma'am, if we're going to have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Ma'am, if you'll give me just some time, we're going to have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And once again, you can ask any questions you want to. We want to talk about those, but we want to have good discourse.
So. And I think the discussion, the question, I appreciate our question about suing the EPA. We had 13 or so lawsuits against the EPA as I was Attorney General. The Sierra Club has sued the EPA a whole lot more than I have over the years, largely because of noncompliance and the EPA not doing their job historically. So go check the number of lawsuits that they filed. But when we talked about regulations earlier on,
Secretary Pruitt,
we talked about
and yet this administration doesn't believe in climate change or global warming. You're gutting the
Sir,
you are threatening the
sir, you're taking away everybody's right here. You're taking away everyone's right. Everyone's right to hear the administrator talk. And I wish.
Hell, how much money are you being paid to do this?
All right.
You're a monster.
Well, I told you that OU Texas was quite intense, but I think what this demonstrates actually, when you look at the past administration, I would ask you to consider something. Look at the past administration and ask yourself what they achieved with respect to environmental outcomes. Air attainment in this country is at 40%, approaching 42% with ozone levels. 140 to 150 million people. There are more Superfund sites in the country now than when President Obama came into office. Water infrastructure, less investment, and we've had situations like Flint. So I would ask you something. This past administration, where are their outcomes that were so good? But yet here we are beginning our term, and we're trying to set a new path forward of actually having objectives that we can all count and measure and provide outcomes that are tangible to the American people. I was in East Chicago early this week at a Superfund site because of the fact that EPA has taken too many years to address concerns of citizens in East Chicago to provide safe drinking water. I was in Missouri yesterday, and there's a facility that's outside of Westlake in St. Louis that's been on the national priority list for the Superfund site for over 20 years, and there still hasn't been a decision by the EPA. Now, that's wrong. And so this administration and myself as administrator, we're trying to go out and do things as opposed to just say things. It's easy to go out and just talk about things. But to actually go out and achieve good outcomes for our citizens with respect to the environmental outcomes is something we should be focused upon, and we are focused upon.
It's a good point, but let's get into some of the things that drive the thing you see here with people that are so passionate. And even though it's disappointing that it results in that dialogue, I admire the fact that people are that passionate about something. And you can also understand, I know we both do, when people do value, especially in Texas, we value our lands, we value our national forests, all of our natural resources. And there's a passion around those. And one thing that we're working on in Texas, we regulate all the oil and gas business, is how can we communicate with people in a way that they understand and they see the things we're doing, because everyone's overloaded with information, right? And you talk about results, and I feel like, man, if I could tell everybody everything we're doing, and we got opportunities to improve, there's no question. You talked about some, we've got some for sure. One of those opportunities, how can I let people know the things we are doing? Where is there enforcement? What things are being done well? Where are areas that we have, these people were problems and we took them out of operation? Once again, at a federal level, do you see this need for information so that people do understand and we're able to engage at a more detailed level?
Yeah, I think what has been missing over the last several years is true partnership and true collaboration. I mean, I mentioned to you the statistic under the Clean Air Act and the number of federal implementation plans versus state implementation plans. And that is not something that should be passed over lightly, because I think best environmental outcomes we can achieve are when states are working with the federal government as opposed to being adversaries of one another. And the litigation that we've seen in the last several years, initiated by various states, but also environmental groups, I think is demonstrative of the fact that we're not working together to achieve good outcomes. And so one of the things I did within the first week of being at the EPA is I had hosted 20 governors at my office, and then I've gone out and met with them in their respective states and tried to restore a measure of confidence, a belief, of trust that we can work together. I mean, in Oklahoma, the state of Texas, you have agencies that are dedicated to regulating water, regulating the air, working together with the EPA to achieve good outcomes as far as attainment and the rest. Why isn't that something we should, be working on together? And I think it's been missing the last several years, Ryan, and it's something we need to restore.
Yeah, I think you're right. Back up a little bit. If you were to look forward, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, and you said, not just you, but what would a real, at that time, because you've talked a lot about results, what would success look like, not just for the EPA, but for our nation when it comes to our environment and the things that we do to regulate on a national, on a state, on a municipal level? Just talk about a vision for how we do things here.
Well, look, as far as attainment is concerned, across this country, we have a lack of data. If you go to counties, we measure attainment by the county level across this country. And many counties don't have monitoring equipment to determine whether they're in compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS program. So we ought to be investing in that with respect to the federal government and the local governments to ensure that we're getting real-time data on compliance with the standards we've set under that NAAQS program. In fact, I think that is essentially important, because what's happening, we see under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to review all those NAAQS criteria pollutants every 5 years. And what's happened historically is the EPA will come in and review that and ratchet those levels down. I think there ought to be more focused upon compliance and assistance with existing levels, getting real-time data with those at the local level, and setting a true agreement in place on how we're going to meet the current levels that are already there. That's not happening largely across the country. On those Superfund sites, some of the most tangible benefits we can provide to citizens across this country is getting those sites cleaned up, having them on the path to remediation. The Port of Portland, 11 miles of shoreline that make up that Superfund site. It's been languishing for years in that Superfund program. We can do better than that as a country in working with local officials, mayors, cities and towns, and the states across the country to say, what's the path forward? What is the remediation that we need to engage in? And let's set a real timeline. Let's not just talk about it for years. Let's set a real timeline that we're going to get these places cleaned up and remediated so that people can start enjoying their communities again and jobs can be created. And that's, I think, something we should be very focused upon, Ryan.
Yeah, I agree. One last question that I'd like to let the audience ask a couple of questions. Can you get specific for me for a minute? And I know you're, 51 days on the job. One of the questions a lot of people ask at all levels, and politics aside, hey, Ryan, what is a regulation? Where should the federal government regulate? I mean, Republicans, anti-federal government, federal bureaucracy, and that's been a mantra of ours, especially as the government has bloated over the last over the last decade. Where is there a role for the federal government? Not just the mix. Where is a role for states? Where's a role for municipalities? I mean, philosophically or even specifically. Can you
well, look, I mean, I've said even before I went through this process of being nominated and going through the confirmation process as Attorney General, I said 2 or 3 years ago that there's a very important role for the EPA to play. There are air quality issues that cross state line. There are transboundary. There are water quality issues. In my own state of Oklahoma, the Illinois River, for years, there's been phosphorus concerns with respect to upstream in Missouri and Arkansas into Oklahoma. We've dealt with that in many ways, but didn't really achieve great outcomes. As Attorney General, I made that a focus, and I worked with my counterpart in Arkansas to get an enforceable agreement in place with respect to those phosphorus levels in the Illinois River. And so there is a place for the EPA to step in to make sure that states are not being injured based upon activities in other states in air quality and water quality. I just think it's important that the EPA stay in its lane and also recognize the role of the states in achieving those good outcomes. What's happened, what's caused the litigation historically, is you have a statute, like the Clean Water Act, that says that the waters of the United States equals one thing, and then a regulation is adopted that's completely opposite. And it creates uncertainty in the marketplace. Those that are regulated don't know what's expected of them. And they don't know whether to follow the statute or to follow the rule. And that's what's caused confusion. And so the best thing we can do in regulating, in my view, is provide certainty, stay within the rule of law and the framework of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, do the job that the EPA has, and then recognize the job that states have, and then work together in partnership to achieve those good outcomes in each of these key areas.
Well, Scott, thank you for all those answers. Do we have time to take a couple of audience questions? I hope we do.
Yeah.
You want to pick or I'll pick? Start on the right.
You're doing good moderating.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sorry about this mic. I'm doing the best I can. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I'm having a little bit of difficulty.
I'll repeat the question if you can.
EPA is taking comments right now about which rules and regs to roll back. And I have a colleague who's read some of the comments and coming for keeping a lot of the regulations on the books. If that continues, how seriously does EPA take those public comments into consideration?
Well,
Let me repeat the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question was, right now the EPA is taking public comment from people on which regulations should be rolled back. There seems to be a trend that EPA is going to keep a lot of regs on the book, I think is what you said. If so, how seriously is the EPA going to take all those public comments?
So this is a great question because it's something that I think is important in the rulemaking process. You know, there's something called the Administrative Procedures Act that governs everything that we do as we adopt rules. And as you engage in rulemaking, the process is you propose a rule, you take comment, and then the agency, whomever has published the rule, has to respond to those comments before they finalize it. There's a reason why that takes place. It's because the rulemaking bodies need to hear from those folks across the country on how it's going to impact citizens in each and every state. Over the last several years, that's not taken place a lot. In fact, what's happened is litigation has been brought by various groups against the EPA to do certain things, and then the EPA will take steps to settle that litigation through something called a consent decree and bypass the rulemaking process altogether, which really subverts the voices of those across the country. And to your question, what I would say to you is those comments are going to be taken very seriously, because that's our job. Our job is to make sure that as people respond to either the withdrawal or the proposal of a rule, we need to evaluate how it's going to impact both health as well as other situations, and then respond accordingly on the record before that rule is finalized. And that's something we're restoring at the EPA. In fact, I've sent out an initiative or a memorandum to our entire agency that governance by consent decrees, governance through the judicial process, regulation through litigation has been stopped. We're going to make sure that the EPA or the APA is maintained.
Thanks, Scott.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, right here in front.
Yes,
Administrator
ma'am.
Pruitt, Commissioner Sitton, Sarah Terry Como with the Journal Record newspaper in
Hello,
Oklahoma City.
hello, Sarah. How are you?
Nice to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Appreciate you taking the question. You mentioned Flint in your comments, and I'm sure you're aware of Hugo, Oklahoma, which had about 8,123 residents whose drinking water did not have enough chlorine for about 300 days over the course of 2.5 years or so. So my question, sir, is how do you plan to improve infrastructure in these small municipalities like Hugo and enforce the State Drinking Water Act while also creating jobs? And are you concerned about any reductions to your budget?
Great question. And two things I would say. With respect to, this is not, I'm going to get to the specifics of the question in a second, but I do want to mention this. With respect to Flint, and situations like that across the country, the EPA has something called 1431 authority, where they can issue an emergency declaration and say that people's health are in a state of risk and hazard, and they can intervene and take over situations like that. In the case of Flint, I believe the EPA should have done that. I believe the EPA should have responded much more aggressively to the situation on the ground in Flint to avoid what happened there. And there are situations like that across the country. Frankly, the situation in East Chicago, we were considering that 2 weeks ago. I was working with the governor in Indiana to ensure that filtration systems were being put on the water system there, to make sure that there weren't lead levels in the water that were going to impact individuals. And they did that, so we didn't have to take 1431 authority. But I want you to know here that there is an ability for the EPA to intervene in situations where local folks are not responding to the health of citizens. And it's important that the EPA respond in those situations. But secondly, with respect to water infrastructure, the president has talked about an infrastructure package. And what I'm very encouraged by, he's asked me to serve on a small group of cabinet officials. There's about 5 of us. And he has said rather emphatically that the infrastructure package should be more than roads and bridges. It should be water infrastructure as well. And when you look at rural counties and rural communities across the country, we desperately need an investment in our water infrastructure. And some of the infrastructure on the East and West, the East Coast particularly, is aged to the point that we need substantial investment in water infrastructure. And so the corrosion control measures are lacking. The piping is old enough where people are experiencing some potentially difficult and harmful outcomes. And so that water infrastructure investment is key. It's something I'm advancing with the president. That's the reason that he's asked me to serve on this infrastructure small working group with the other cabinet officials.
Awesome. We are getting the hook, I'm being told. So I'm sorry to have to cut this off soon, so early. Scott, if I can share this one last thought. It's times like this where we go into a situation like this and have some open dialogue. Thank you for making time to do this. Thank all of you for the dialogue we were able to have and the questions you asked. I'll be able to stick around for a little while. I know you've got to run. If y'all would join me in thanking Scott for coming down and spending time with us.